Oh, hi! Hi! Hello! Welcome to another story time. So today we've got the eagle and the condor. So let's start. Once upon a time.
No. I'm sorry. It's not story time, it's history time.
All right, so let's get down to business then. In any case, our episode today is about an eagle. No, not that eagle. I mean that one.
And about a condor, better known as Condor Operation, and specifically how it was enacted in Argentina.
Right. So Operation Condor was a secret intelligence and operations systems in the 70s through which the US collaborated to install military coups in South America. These military coups kidnapped, tortured, and executed political dissidents as an attempt to prevent the spread of populist ideas in Latin America. McJerry claims that it was a secret component of a US-led counterinsurgency strategy to prevent or reverse social movements demanding political or social economic change.
And according to Whittaker, although Operation Condor officially started in 1975, informal Condor collaboration began as early as August 1973, that is 2 years before the traditionally recognized date. And this operation consisted of 3 levels or phases. The first one was mutual cooperation among military intelligence services to coordinate political surveillance of targeted dissidents and exchange intelligence information. The second stage, or phase, was covert action in which multinational Condor squadrons carried out covert cross-border operations to detain exiles and transfer them to their countries of origin, where most of them disappeared forever.
The third and the most secret level of Condor assassination's capability was known as Phase 3. During this phase, special teams of assassins were formed to travel worldwide to eliminate what they called subversive enemies. Phase 3 was specifically aimed at political leaders who had the potential to mobilize world opinion and to organize broad opposition to military states and were thus feared by the US.
Exactly. But to understand the reasons behind the US intervention in South America, we need to go more than a century back. Let's begin with the Monroe Doctrine. According to Hochbound, it expressed hostility to any further colonization or political intervention by European powers in the Western Hemisphere. The doctrine was first introduced in 1823 and subsequently reenacted throughout the 20th century. All right, if this sounds too complicated, let's put it like this. President Monroe ensured European powers that the US would not intervene in European affairs only if Europeans retreated from any attempt to colonize a nation in the Western Hemisphere.
All right, there was a lot going on in the 20th century, so if you want to know more, make sure you click and watch our following video. But now, let's focus on the Cold War.
Winter is coming.
Many authors consider that the Cold War was World War III, the war of ideologies. In fact, during this period of time, the US and the USSR emerged as ideological, political, and economic world powers which competed for supremacy. In this context of the Cold War, the Monroe Doctrine gained more relevance during the 60s and the 70s because it was used to justify the US intervention in Latin American countries.
Well, I think it's time to introduce the 2 stars of this show, starring American exceptionalism and its little brother, American interventionism.
All right, but what do we understand by American exceptionalism? This term has been widely discussed by many different scholars. One of them, Lipset, in Gilmore, explains that it is the idea that the United States is a singular, superior country in the international community. Some other authors, such as Foner, use it in a more missionary sense. As a matter of fact, he defines it as the belief that the United States has a special mission to serve as refuge from tyranny and a symbol of freedom and a model for the rest of the world.
Henry Kissinger, who is a character that we'll be starring later on, also refers to this notion. In his book, Diplomacy, he expresses, open quote, in the 20th century surfaced a new variant of American exceptionalism. With all of its imperfections, the America of the 19th century had thought of itself as a beacon of liberty. In the 1960s and 70s, the torch was said to be flickering and would need to be relit before America could return to its historic role as an inspiration to the cause of freedom.
On the other hand, by American interventionism, we understand the US political and military intrusion in other countries' attitudes, in other countries' policies and affairs. So it is true that all those ingredients led to a lethal combination, but Cuba was the cherry on top.
La victoria es cierta. Patria o muerte.
In 1959, the Cuban Revolution erupted, forcing the end of the anti-communist US ally Batista's government. As McSherry explains, and I quote, in the midst of this social movement, US national security strategists who feared another Cuba and their Latin American counterparts began to regard leaders and members of the leftist or popular movements as subversive and therefore dangerous.
Okay, but wait. My nerd self needs to make a quick intervention. Populism is a concept coined by neo-Marxist sociologist Ernesto Laclau. Whereas it is polysemic, that is, it has several meanings, for the purpose of this video, we will use Laclau's definition. He defines it as a way of doing politics. That means putting the established institutional order into question by constructing an underdog as a historical agent, that is, an agent which is an other in relation to the way things stand. According to him, the emergence of populism presupposes the emergence of national political leaders with direct contact with the masses, which is seen as a threat to the dominant classes.
In the case of Argentina, for example, the interest of the dominant classes, that is, the large landowners, the members of the financial system, and the most conservative members of the Catholic Church, have historically been aligned to those of foreign powers such as Great Britain and the US. So any threats to the interest of the oligarchy, that is, the dominant classes in Argentina, can be seen as a threat to the US. In fact, McSherry explains that subversives could be defined as those with dangerous ideas, those that challenge the traditional order, and it didn't matter whether they were peaceful dissenters, social activists, or even armed revolutionaries. They were all considered subversive and thus a danger.
And this can be illustrated with one of the most quoted comments of the Argentinian general Jorge Rafael Videla, who says that, and I open quote, a terrorist is not just someone with a gun or a bomb, but also someone who spreads ideas that are contrary to Western and Christian civilization, end quote. Disclaimer here. Although it is true that Videla cannot be seen as the only representative of the dominant classes in Argentina, his words certainly show something that was true for many at that time.
Speaking of Argentina, let's go to 1975 and see how the plot thickens. By that time, military coups had been already established in several Latin American countries. For example, Paraguay in 1954, Brazil in 1964, Bolivia in 1971, and Chile and Uruguay in 1973. In Argentina, Juan Domingo Perón, who was the main leader of the populist movement, had died, and Isabel, his widow, had already taken over as president. These were tiring times for Argentina. Political and economic instability were common currency, and Operation Condor was secretly on the go. Let's go and see some primary sources.
October 1975. DINA Chief Manuel Contreras wrote a letter to invite General Francisco Brites, Chief of the Paraguayan Police, to a working meeting of national intelligence to be held in Santiago under strict secrecy. The purpose of the meeting was to establish excellent coordination and improved action to benefit national security.
In November 1975, Operation Condor is established during the first Inter-American Working Meeting of Intelligence in Santiago. The minutes of conclusion of this meeting gives us details about the mission, coordination, communications, intelligence, and joint operations. It also identifies the origins of the name of this cross-border collaboration, Chile's national bird, the condor. This organization will be called Condor by unanimous approval of the motion presented by the Uruguayan delegation to honor our host country, the document concludes. It is signed by 5 of the highest-ranking intelligence officers in the Southern Cone, representing the original Condor nations, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. Later, Brazil, Peru, and Ecuador joined Condor.
It's March 24th, 1976. A military coup takes power in Argentina.
Comunica a la población que a partir de la fecha el país se encuentra bajo el control operacional de la Junta Militar. Se recomienda a todos los habitantes el estricto acatamiento a las disposiciones y directivas que emanen de autoridad militar, de seguridad o policial, así como extremar el cuidado en evitar acciones y actitudes individuales o de grupo que puedan exigir la intervención drástica del personal en operaciones. Firmado Jorge Rafael Videla, Teniente General, Comandante General del Ejército.
During a June 1976 OAS meeting in Santiago, Chile, which corresponded with the second Condor meeting also held in Santiago at the same time, Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of the State in the US, met privately with Admiral Cesar Guzzetti, Foreign Minister of Argentina's military regime. The declassified MEMCOM reveals that Kissinger encouraged the ongoing internal repression in Argentina. In the document, he even states that if there are things that have to be done, you should do them quickly. And he also endorsed the joint efforts with other Southern Cone regimes that Guzzetti described to address the terrorist problem. In what appears to be the very first time Kissinger is told of the Condor collaboration, Guzzetti tells him that Argentina wants to integrate with our neighbors, all of them Chile, Paraguay, Bolivia, Uruguay, and Brazil, to fight subversion.
The 23rd of August of 1976, Kissinger sent a long secret cable titled Operation Condor. In this cable, he expressed his worries about the violent practices and killings taking place in Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. As McSherry points out, the message was clear. They knew what was going on and didn't approve, but didn't stop it either. The dictatorship in Argentina ended in 1983. However, it is a scar that remains in our country's collective memory. In his book, Forner states that this military dictatorship, in the name of anti-communism, had launched a dirty war against its own citizens, kidnapping off the streets and secretly murdering an estimated of 10,000 people to 30,000 people.
Ever since, Argentina enacted a series of public policies to enforce justice. They brought the military coups to trial, created the Comisión Nacional sobre la Desaparición de Personas, that is CONADEP, and CONADEP, together with its report Nunca Más, became models for other international commissions aiming at uncovering the truth behind the military regimes that took place in Latin America in the late 20th century.
Even though Operation Condor contributed to one of the darkest chapters in our history, it has been systematically erased from the US and the world history, as if an attempt to erase the horrors fostered by the civilized world. But like any wound, it leaves a scar. This is why we think it's very important to shed some light on this matter and to make sure that this never happens again. Or taking the Argentinian phrase, nunca más.